Okay, so Little Nightmares is a 2017 puzzle platform video game where the player controls a young girl called Six, with him here in her little iconic yellow raincoat, as she travels through a massive ship called the Moor. Although there's no dialogue or background given for the events of the game, exposition and narrative is provided via its use of landscape, environmental storytelling, and cultural iconography. The uncanny environment is skewed against the player. Six is tiny compared to her surroundings, which are out of proportion, vast and distorted. Harmless, skittish gnomes scuttle about in secret passageways, while Six, who has no fighting abilities, must avoid capture by the deformed and grotesque monsters that lurk within the moor. At times, Six is disabled by bouts of painfully intense hunger, where she's compelled to eat whatever is nearby, including, at one point, a friendly gnome who attempts to offer her food. And I would say, could you switch to the next slide? But I can't see it. So I don't know if it's gone AWOL.
We're currently on the synopsis one.
Okay, thank you. I can't see it.
I just want to say that it's not showing up for me.
Yeah.
Hang on.
No problem.
I'm going to keep going just because of time. The landscape is designed to both literally and figuratively swallow Six up, and it's ultimately revealed that the moor is a vessel designed for the raising, cooking, and eating. Thanks, Mel. And eating of children. Towards the end of the game, Six must run through a gauntlet of disgusting and ravenous patrons as they guzzle compulsively at a carnivorous feast. Too obese to walk, these patrons groan hungrily as they crawl after Six, becoming a mass of bodies that threaten to either crush or consume her. While exploring the top portion of the moor, Six is attacked by a figure called the Lady, who is defeated after Six forces her to look at her reflection. After the Lady is defeated, Six consumes both her and her powers, using them to finally escape the moor, psychokinetically destroying any patrons that attempt to come after her. And could we have the next one, please, Mel, when you can? Little Nightmares is rife with Gothic motifs and themes. There's everything from doubling and abuses of power to the more specific settings of an expansive library and creepy portraits and all these things. However, the landscape itself is dynamic as well as symbolic. The frame slowly moves from side to side to reflect the rocking of the boat, long before it's revealed that we're at sea. And the soundscape is made up of horrific squeals and groans, where echoes of machinery, sorrow, and digestion blend together to create a claustrophobic discord. While the main musical theme is made up of music boxes and ethereal voices with this tune that's sort of vaguely reminiscent of Three Blind Mice. That's great, Mel, thank you. The moor becomes a Gothic haunted house, or what Barry Curtis calls, sorry, can you go back one please, Mel? Calls a dark space. Thank you. And what we argue here is that Little Nightmares is an allegory for childhood trauma and abuse, utilising Gothic motifs with mise-en-scène to create a projection of childhood trauma centred around fears of consumption, of being overwhelmed, overpowered and lost. Therefore, the moor becomes a perilous transitional labyrinth that Six must traverse in order to finally confront the source of the traumatic space and journey into adulthood, crossing into dark worlds and darker psyches to do so. The moor's distorted perspective and an uncanny landscape, haunted by childhood fears, create an atmosphere of hopelessness and despair, a cyclic continuation of abuse and trauma like a snake eating its tail, where taboos and transgressions are signalled through horror symbology, manifested through the untold stories found in the landscape. Next, please. I do feel very powerful. The moor itself is a gigantic vessel that from the outside looks like a bloated digestive system. Spending most of its time almost submerged, apart from a small smokestack on top, it occasionally emerges to welcome its obese masked clients who enter to gorge themselves on this seemingly never-ending feast. The guests board the vessel through an entrance resembling a giant mouth, which is obviously very suitable, but suitably symbolic for somewhere called the moor, and you can see it on the top left. The majority remaining in its upper layers, or what could be called the throat area, rather than the stomach or bowels of the ship, where the meat is prepared and raised for slaughter. In reflection of Gaston Bachelard, and I'm sorry for my pronunciation, context of the house, where dreams happen in the attic while nightmares take place in the basement, the horrors of the moor become increasingly degenerate the further down you go, with the bottom layers, which are portrayed in the DLC, the depths, being flooded, decrepit, and home to this very monstrous creature called Granny, who will grab the player and drag them underwater to drown. Next, please. Of course, the main purpose of the Moor is for the preparation and consumption of children. From Kronos to Hansel and Gretel, fairy tales and mythology are rife with tales of adults or monsters devouring children. Marina Warner argues that cannibalism in fairy tales can represent sexual union, pregnancy, so representing captivity, and paternal or patriarchal control. So we argued that the Moor is a space of maternal, not paternal horror. Maternal, not paternal, sorry, that. As discussed in detail by Sarah Arnold, which focuses on the absorption or, quote, overwhelming dominance of the mother, with the lady in control of the cavernous factory that's littered with the passages, tunnels, and water of Barbara Cree's infamous discussion of the monstrous feminine in Alien. Next, please. Excuse my pronunciations again, but scholars such as Lorna Piatti-Farnell, Faisy Falk, and Elizabeth Gross write about the horrors of the mouth, noting its liminality and importance as both a boundary to the body, so thereby leaves the body vulnerable to the world, and the world vulnerable to a potentially alien body, as a vestibule or site of judgment. Piatti-Farnell writes about the mouth as a site of sinister othering because of the potentially alienating, disgusting, or even forbidden nature of food. The Moor, therefore, becomes an othering and transitional space, where trauma ultimately others the subject, altering them into a monstrous counterpart. Even states of being are in flux here, with the subject made into objects, people into product, and the individual into mass. Next one, please. The inside of the Moor is an eerie and uncanny labyrinth. Its shadowy spaces seeped in sinister environmental storytelling, distorted or displaced furniture, and grotesque monsters. There are influences from Studio Ghibli, Stephen King's It, and German Expressionism, particularly in the disproportional stretched-out objects, emotive chiaroscuro, and repeating patterns and symbols, such as the all-seeing eye that appears on everything from doors and furniture to the wallpaper. Next, please. Chairs and pianos hang from the ceiling. There are secret passages, traps, and cramped ducts and spaces under floors that only the tiny protagonist can access. Even the shadows themselves hide secrets, such as the scene from the DLC where the shadows of the gnomes reveal their origins as children. Next, please. The rooms and mini-monsters that Six encounters allude to past traumas. One of the first rooms reveal the hanged body of the Thin Man, whose origins are explored in the prequel. Another houses an eye that will petrify children if they're caught in its light, and the room is kind of dotted with these little ashen bodies. Arguably, one of the most disturbing rooms is filled with shoes, a disquieting note to the number of previous victims, but also reminiscent of historical trauma and the images of shoes from concentration camps. Each room allows the player to build more of the world and decipher more of the story, from the children sleeping in the nursery and huddled in cages, through the repulsive kitchens and dining rooms to the home of the lady who controls this disturbing system. Like the haunted houses of Gothic fiction, it's clear that something terrible has happened here, and has been happening for a very long time. The horror of the space is created as much, if not more, through the evidence of trauma left behind than by any action actually seen on screen. The environment is unnerving, both because of disquieting mise-en-scène or atmosphere, but also because of the unspoken, unacknowledged trauma that's hinted at but never commented on. And I'm going to hand over to Mel here, who's going to talk a bit more about traumatic space and about the characters in the game. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Good evening.
Sorry, Melody, just to interrupt, but you are on mute.
You don't want to listen to me anyway, do you? I could just mime my way through. Hi. Right, so traumatic space. Little Nightmares is a singular tale of abuse and trauma that causes the landscape and environment to become a traumatic space that the protagonist must then work through in order to face the trauma and survive. These aesthetically uncanny spaces bring further horror to the game's mise-en-scène, with leeches, beds with straps on them, ropes in rooms in order for you to escape on, and these hidden dark recesses, and even children in cages that are waiting to be eaten. As theorist Kathy Carruth posited, the experience of trauma is often so painful that it cannot be cognitively grasped. It makes conscious memories inaccessible. Therefore, trauma becomes a relived experience, non-linear in fashion, and fragments of memories often become twisted and distorted and repeated over and over again until the experience can be made sense of. The repetitive and non-linear fashion of this game and the nature of trauma itself ensures that it offers quite a diverse range of twisted figures, warped environments, and creepy objects that bring the trauma and space to this environment. And just as with trauma, they are unclear and distorted fragments. They cannot be communicated clearly and instead must be worked through like a puzzle in order to survive to the next level. For instance, I'm not sure if it shows because it's a really dark game as well to get shots from, but the very small child-sized guillotine placed next to an oversized bathtub again offers this contrasting ratio and distorts the environment as a way to further add to these trauma spaces. Okay, every time I press that button, it wants to mute me. So the psychological landscapes in this game, often psychological landscapes are represented as an unconscious space when the protagonist will have an inner psychological conflict, and what we see is a projection of this inner turmoil. In the case of Little Nightmares, it is Six's tale of abuse and childhood trauma being projected onto the screen. As a distorted nightmare world in which Six revisits, perhaps over and over, in order to work through her trauma and past memories, it becomes this psychological space within her own traumatised mind. Her identity has been lost and she needs to rediscover who she really is now as she transitions from a child towards adulthood. These psychological landscapes that we see are themselves a form of transitional spaces. And as Donna Winnicott posited as well, an area of in-between is what they are. They're both reality and fantasy. They're also neither real nor unreal. They're neither inside nor out, and they become a space where identity and trauma can be experienced and worked through. However, the lost self here searches for the truth, and to conquer the monstrous forms of other, and in this other in space, what we see in Little Nightmares is monstrous others in the form of adults as well. So I'll just briefly go over the main children of the game. So in the game, you play as protagonist Six, the little yellow raincoated, quite mysterious child. To survive the moor, you must not only traverse through the puzzle environment and avoid the grotesque, monstrous adults, you must also consume when bouts of severe hunger hit you. So when this hunger rises inside of Six, she must eat. She's consumed by something, and the game progresses towards letting the player know exactly what this is later on towards the end. Six's primal instincts are not just about hunger either. They also become apparent as she uses natural fire as a way to not only light the way, but to also warm herself. And she even uses her bare hands to eat or harm others. Six appears innocent, a lost victim of abuse, reliving trauma and trying to survive. But there's something else to her story. She's becoming something else. The DLCs in Little Nightmares 2 do offer a much bigger development of this, and myself and Catherine are working on this as we speak in terms of Six's story. So the gnome, I just want to briefly mention the other little children in it. We've got the gnomes and the cage children. The little gnomes, they've got like these little cute hats on. They represent younger children or the forgotten children of society. As they're smaller, their identities are hidden in order to protect their remaining innocence in this abusive tale. The gnomes are also quite helpful and they can even be hugged. Unfortunately, they are vulnerable and rarely survive. Yet if you do hug them all, there is a secret to unlock at the end where you can get some of them to survive. The moor also holds caged children within its depths. These children have been captured by the janitor and are kept until it's time to be wrapped in cloths and sent to the kitchen, likely to be cooked and eaten by the guests. The captured and caged children are not small as the gnomes and are similar in age and height to Six. They're much less likely to be saved at this point because these children represent the ones that are too far into the system of abuse and will now be devoured by it. With a backbone of abuse and surveillance whereby corruption and power consumes the innocent, the deformed, monstrous adults in the game are the antagonists. They are the othered part of the game's uncanny nightmare. Many of these grotesque adults, as you can see, wear masks. They have no identities and are seemingly these faceless, anonymous objections of Six's traumatic tale of abuse. The adults that have masks here represent not only an objected and distorted fragment of Six's trauma, but they also themselves may wish to remain without identity. Perhaps they hide behind their masks because they are doing unspeakable things. The lady I'll just briefly go over these, but the lady is the final and ultimate antagonist for Six towards the end, who even since the beginning of the game, Six has been dreaming of. Now, unlike the other monstrous adults of the Maw, the lady is not necessarily driven by the same amount of greedy, disgusting habits and hunger that the other guests and staff are. Instead, she appears more graceful and more inhibited than the others. And yet the lady has a certain unwillingness to deal with her own monstrous image and her own monstrous dealings, and it's ultimately her downfall. She's reluctant to accept the damage caused on her part by this tale, and this is what ultimately gets her killed and then devoured. Sorry, spoiler alert there. This happens when Six is able to finally show the lady her true reflection in the mirror, and she sees the form of her true self, bringing her demise. The janitor is one of the first main antagonists, and probably my least favourite when I'm playing, because his long, spindly reaching arms and large, oversized head form quite a distorted image. As perhaps Lacan put, he represents this form of father of the law. So he's this male authority figure, and he attempts to capture and hold the children before feeding them into the abuse system, seen here, for instance, in the kitchen. The janitor also brings this sense of inevitability and a loss of hope. No escape from your childhood trauma as he reaches out to grasp for you. And then the chefs and the guests, a form of deformed greed. So the disfigured, ugly twin chefs, as you see here from the kitchen, and the malformed guests that come on board the Maw in order to feed. They are as much a part of the traumatized spaces in the game as the environment itself and the mise-en-scène objects are. Their deformed masks on their faces, their disgusting bodies, are very representative of Six's feelings towards adults that she's already had to survive. Child abuse and trauma can bring forth very ugly misrepresentations of those who have caused psychological damage. These monstrous guests and staff have been placed into a distorted form in this space in order to represent this abject adult who has caused such suffering to Six and to other children. And as I just mentioned briefly before, the becoming of Six, many abused children cling to hope that growing up will bring escape, it will bring freedom. Often trauma is too hard to escape from and continues to be relived even in adulthood. There is often no escape in these forms of platforms and games and films from becoming a traumatized adult after you've been a traumatized child. As Six escapes each horrific area, she herself is transitioning into what she fears to be. Perhaps another abuser, to become like the lady, but definitely to become a monstrous adult herself. One that not only consumes others, but feeds that consumption to others as well. The ending, although it appears a happy one, because hopefully some of the gnomes have survived because you've hugged enough of them, and Six finally reaches the exit to the Maw, it's not as happy as it at first seems. The lady, after being defeated by Six, is also consumed by the lady's powers when she takes the lady's powers into her as she transitions finally from this traumatic space into something else. As Six leaves the Maw, she goes through the dining room and she can even consume the guests by devouring their souls and their life source. And she almost appears fearless then as she leaves. She has transcended, but become something that is not necessarily as innocent and nice as we'd have hoped. Because of her experience of trauma and being relived on the Maw and Six's transition into adulthood with the same capabilities of the lady, the resulting violence and insatiable hunger mean now that Six herself has finally become her own little nightmare.